Hello there and welcome to Discover History, the podcast where people from all walks of life discuss the topics they are passionate about. On today's show we will be discussing the ancient historian Herodotus. Joining us is Sondre Amundsen. Hello Sondre and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alan.
Why don't we begin with an overview of who Herodotus was?
Okay, so Herodotus was what many would consider, at least in antiquity, the father of history, as Cicero called him. So he is certainly the first writer at least in the Western tradition, compiled what we would call a work of history today. So there'd been a couple people before him, like Herodotus or Miletus. He wrote a similar work, but Herodotus was really a pioneer in his field, as he was the first one to try to employ some healthy source criticism, and he sort of employed this sort of standard method of getting information from sources and distilling that information and then writing history work.
Where was Herodotus from and what period was he writing in?
So he was born in Halicarnassus, which was a Greek city situated on what is today modern Turkey, so on the Aegean coast on Turkey's side. Because, I mean, in ancient days, sort of the Greek world wasn't just in what modern day Greece, it sort of encompassed, well, both sort of the Turkish and Greek sides, and also later they had just colonies over the entire Mediterranean and Black Sea. They just really spread everywhere. So he's writing mainly about the Persian Wars, which was a war in which Persia invaded Greece, and you get all those famous stories like Thermopylae and, well, you know, the 300 Spartans. Everything comes from him, and he's writing about this specific war. So the important thing to know about this, like Halicarnassus, was Persian controlled for quite a long time. So he sort of has a personal interest in it, and he probably grew up under the Persian regime. He's writing about like 30, 50 years after the Persian Wars took place. So we think he was writing in Athens in the 430s BC. So it's almost 2,500 years old work.
Growing up in a Greek city that was controlled by the Persians, do you think this gave him a broader perspective and interest in other cultures, rather than a purely Greek-centric point of view?
I think he's certainly interested in varying cultures, having sort of experienced a lot of that. The Persians themselves as a culture were pretty multicultural, in the sense that sort of the Persians themselves were distinct people who made an empire, but they weren't afraid of employing all these other peoples that incorporated an empire. And you got to remember, the Persian Empire was huge. It stretched from Greece really all the way over to modern Afghanistan and north from southern Russia down to Egypt. So there were a whole lot of various cultures, like Indians and Egyptians and everything. So he probably got to experience a little bit of this multicultural diversity. Maybe that's part of why he's interested in all these peoples that we'll get to.
What was Herodotus' approach to recording history? Was he similar to his contemporaries, or did he conduct it in a novel way?
So, as I said earlier, he was a pioneer in his field. So he drew on some older traditions like Herodotus, who wrote a sort of travel guide, essentially, which mostly now consists of fragments. And before him, as far as we know, there weren't that many. So he draws on what he knows. Homer was very influential.
How does he draw on the Homeric tradition to inform his histories?
Yes, so, I mean, he likes to draw on myth a lot, especially in the history that he's writing about, well, sort of past his ancient history for him, going back more than before the Persian Wars. The further he goes back in his history, sort of the more inconsistent and sort of the more fantastic the nature of his work becomes. And that's sort of that's partly because the only source available to him is myth, and he uses Homer as a sort of reference, and he's using him as inspiration. So you get a lot of Homeric inspiration, and this sort of infuses his entire work, because he tends to view or try to explain events as from a point of causation, right? So he's talking about hubris, this sort of arching pride that leads to an inevitable downfall, nemesis. So that's sort of what happens to Persia in his opinion. They impiously seeks to conquer the whole world, and the gods punish the Persians for that.
You mentioned that it's based on the Persian-Greek War. Is his work similar to other histories that concentrate heavily on the actual battles themselves?
Mainly his work is about the Persian Wars. Like, it is a war narrative. But the funny thing about this, okay, so his history is divided into these 9 books, which was admittedly a later invention. It wasn't 9 books when he wrote it. But still, I mean, he doesn't start talking about the actual Persian Wars until like halfway out in the book. So there's a lot of stuff going on before that. So important thing to know about this, he's very interested in causation, like why things happen. And he often gets very sort of detective about this. So he wants to go all the way back, try to discover why things happened. So he starts off going like hundreds of years in the past. And then he has a thing about, he's very interested in everything that remotely touches upon his subject. So when he touches upon something, like for example, when it comes to talk about Lydia, an ancient kingdom in modern day Turkey, he goes on this huge digression about King Croesus's storyline and his sort of hubris nemesis timeline, and then he goes into the Lydians' customs and then sort of touches upon their favorite monuments and stuff like that, and he does this a lot. He devotes an entire book, like a modern book, to talk about Egypt, not Egyptian history, but literally just customs and the way they dress, religious stuff, like everything. He's really interested in everything. So from a modern point of view, it's not as much of a history as we would call it today. It's more of an encyclopedic work. But intertwined with that, he's also a masterful storyteller. So he loves telling these wild stories. So it is a really complex work. I don't think it does it justice to just call it a history work.
Do you think he liked to tell the stories in the manner that you just described because they were spoken to crowds, and therefore you have that element of keeping your audience both engaged and entertained?
I definitely think so, yes, because he was writing this down, but he was living in a time where stuff tended to be transmitted orally rather than through written records. We think that he had a crowd, possibly in Athens, that sort of listened to him. And then people later sort of considered it a sort of a written work that they read. But at the time, he was transmitting these stories and this information orally, which is, I think, part of the appeal of his work, because you get all these amazing stories that he's been criticized for this by later ancient authors like Thucydides. Not directly, but we're pretty sure that he's talking about Herodotus.
This approach of diverging into various topics, even to the extent of dedicating a whole book to one nation, it must give us a wonderful insight into the cultures and customs of the different peoples at this time.
Yes, certainly. He did travel a lot. He'd go to several places like Egypt, for example, and try to write down everything he found interesting, because that's sort of how the work functions. He's not simply writing like what we would consider modern history. He's writing down everything that he finds interesting. And he does this in a way that he digresses and stuff a lot. So, for example, in this quote for context, he's talking about how like different climates affect the growth of animal horns for some reason. And then he says, he begs the reader's pardon to sort of digress even further. Quote, "As I have sought opportunities to do from the moment I started this account of my inquiries." So that's sort of a major statement on his approaches. By the way, I'm using the translation by Tom Holland, if anyone wants to sort of check these quotes for themselves. It's a very good translation. Recently read it during the summer with good notes and an introduction by Paul Cartledge, so check that out.
Herodotus relies on his own eyes as a major source for his work, which in ancient Greece was considered the most reliable source for writing histories. However, what other sources did he draw from?
He mainly used eyewitness sources, because as I was saying earlier, he lived in a time where oral tradition was key. Obviously they had writing at this time. He wrote in a time where there weren't as yet as much written records available to him. What there was mainly inscriptions and stuff and some poetry. He was also very much a pioneer, so in lack of such sources as later authors would take extensive use of, he had to rely on eyewitnesses. And this becomes a problem, especially when he's talking about history several hundred years in the back. Because the thing about oral history is that it tends to get more garbled along the way, because the one thing gets transmitted from one person and then to another, and then it gets more and more sort of garbled. he uses both Greeks and Persians, but also other. I mean, he says he's talked to like representatives from other cultures, like from the Arabians, Indians, and Egyptians, which I suppose also makes him quite unique, because he's sort of expanding out from this Greek sphere, which sort of makes him a bit unique. He's not mainly trying to see stuff from a Greek viewpoint, but he has to sort of relate everything back to the Greeks, so they have a point of reference to understand this. So, but even then, I mean, among his sources, there's literally only 3 named individuals. This is even worse. He's only got 1. So, and yes, inscriptions, as I said, sort of adds to this. There's some that he quotes directly.
Are these inscriptions from the Persian monarchy, or are they from various other peoples?
I think he's talking about some inscriptions that he don't quote directly in Egypt, which might have been put up by Persians, but I don't really remember. The ones that I do remember, he's quoting directly from are Greek inscriptions that he's been to see himself. There's 3 in Thermopylae, where the Spartans had their famous last stand, and there's several inscriptions in Delphi, where the Greek oracle, like the famous Pythian oracle of Apollo, sat. And he's providing pretty good descriptions of these places that he went to, so I'm pretty sure that he actually went to these places and saw this inscription for himself.
How does Herodotus actually determine the reliability of his sources?
He's relying much on his own sort of deduction and what he sees himself. He has a lot of like digressions throughout his work, where just logically this must mean based on this, because I see that it is so. So there's a lot of that. There's eyewitness accounts, and from that it sort of has a hierarchy, as I think Tom Holland says in his introduction, and that I agree with. That he's sort of putting his own sort of eyes and ears first, and then sort of eyewitness accounts, and then hearsay. So it gets even worse, and then tradition. And if you're reading the work from the beginning, it sort of goes in the opposite direction, right? So you just get these weird mythic traditions, and then it gets more reliable and more reliable. And when you get to sort of the Persian Wars, a lot of the stuff there is quite reliable. But sort of the further back you go, it's quite, just funny to read, really. So yes, that's sort of how it determines the reliability of his sources. So one major problem of his in here was that he only spoke Greek, right? So this becomes a problem when he sort of branches out from the Greek world, and when he goes to Egypt and stuff, he had to rely on interpreters. So this might sort of have been one way in which his reliability is a bit shaky, maybe, especially if his interpreters want to fool him. Like, for example, as one of his problems was one of these instances was when he's talking about the pyramids. He said it was a sign in Egyptian writing, so probably in hieroglyphic writing, where it said that sort of the total cost for the entire workforce that built the pyramids, measured in garlic, radishes, and onions for some reason, was 1,600 talents, Greek talents, which would be equivalent to like 9,600,000 drachmas, where like 1 drachma was roughly the daily wage for a skilled laborer at the time. I mean, in his footnote, Paul Cotledge says that, I'm pretty sure Herodotus interpreters pulled his leg on this one. So there's several instances of that throughout the text. Especially if he's talking about places he hasn't been to, it tends to get a bit fantastical.
Herodotus informs us he heard 4 different accounts regarding the rise of Cyrus. How does he shift through these accounts, and which one does he tell us about? And did he tell us why he favoured that one?
Yes, I mean, he's talking about sort of, he wants to know who this man Cyrus was and how he came to sort of conquer Asia. And he says, quote, "I have uncovered 4 different accounts, and each one serves to shed its own light upon Cyrus. But the version I have chosen to follow is the one told by those Persians who think it more important to get the facts straight than simply to exalt Cyrus."
It sounds like Herodotus stuck to the principle of attempting to get to the truth of the matter.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what he's trying to do. I mean, I think he definitely tries to get the story straight. But then again, in this passage, he's talking about how one of the stories the Persians tell themselves. And now you got to remember, they obviously spoke Persian, right? So again, he had to rely on interpreters for this. He's talking to all these sort of various sources in Persian, and he gets different stories from them. So, I mean, how does he choose which one to believe? I mean, it's a problem he has throughout his work, I think. Sometimes he literally doesn't know, and he says so. Like, I have no idea which one of these stories is true. I'll make sort of the reader make the judgment by himself. I mean, in this case, I think he's choosing to believe the Persians in this. At least that's what it appears from context.
I feel it gives weight to his own opinions when he can actually be honest enough to say, look, I don't know, but here are the options. You can make up your own mind.
Then again, there's another famous example. There's this story tells, referred to in modern texts as the constitutional debate in book 3, where there's a fictional gathering of these 7 Persian noblemen who's performed a coup d'etat for the Persian throne. And they have this debate about what type of government to employ now. So there's this one guy saying, "Oh, monarchy is the best form." I mean, I think that's Darius, the next king. It's obviously better than democracy and oligarchy. And then you've got one person sort of standing up for the democracy and another for oligarchy, and it seems very fictional, right? And like, why on earth would the Persians, where they've already had monarchies, suddenly have these discussions? And yeah, it feels very off. And at the beginning of this passage, he says that now many people will read this and think that this is made up, but I swear to God, this is the truth.
I can actually relate to his audience's skepticism. Unless you were there, how do you know what was said in private? Subsequent historians have suggested he was really discussing the city-state rivalries in the Greek world at this time, as they either had one of the 3 mentioned system or a hybrid mix of them. Do you think he was subtly arguing for democracy?
I don't think any of those 3 options sort of win the day. I mean, obviously sort of monarchy ends up winning the day, but I don't think any of them has any sort of upper hand against the other. But the debate itself is much more at place in sort of an Athenian intellectual environment than it is in Persia at a time where there was no democracy. Because this was talking about events happening in the 530s or something like that, and that's way before Athens adopted democracy. I'm not sure what Herodotus' own political views would be, because he'd been growing up under a Persian regime, which wasn't necessarily a bad regime for him. But then again, he was talking to a democratic audience in Athens. So no, I'm not sure.
How do you think this breadth of sources influences his work?
I mean, he certainly comes across as very sort of open-minded, right? And has a sort of modern approach to recording history by sort of chatting with people from all sides of the conflict to try to make up his mind. I mean, yeah, we see this throughout his work. He's talking with Persians and Egyptians. This really sets him apart from his contemporaries, I think. Yeah, I mean, he tries to see the story from different perspectives, but I think, the picture is painted in the favor of the Greeks. That I think that's partly because, I mean, he's talking to the Greek audience. So we know there were, for example, I can't remember who wrote this, but it was a tragic play written by an Athenian the play got banned. I'm not sure what happened to the playwright, because, well, it was sort of talking about some stuff that weren't really considered democratic or sort of was considered a bit un-Greek. So he might have had to be a bit careful if he wanted this story to be believed. It might also be that since he's talking to a Greek audience, he has to sort of, as I said earlier, he sort of has to sort of ground his observations in sort of a Greek point of view. But yes, I think it sets him apart from his contemporaries, and he sort of uses all these various people, and just by using stuff like inscriptions and trying to use different sources is something that's not been seen before, really, in the Western tradition.
Do you think his travels helped to set him apart from his contemporaries?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think by traveling so much, he shows a real commitment to trying to get to the bottom of the truth, and he really wants to find. He wants to know the facts. He doesn't just want to be a teller of tall tales. Although it seems, he certainly seems to enjoy telling these stories. But when he tells these stories, sometimes he just says, "Oh, this story is straight up not true," but I'm going to tell it anyway because he's also sort of recording information. He's sort of doing this dual thing where he's trying to get to the bottom of the truth, but he's also trying to sort of just convey information and record it, so that he says that in his introduction, that so that the memory of this won't get lost to time, right? So his travels, it usually tells us explicitly that he spent to certain places. For example, to Egypt, he travels there, spends a good amount of time in Memphis, the ancient Egyptian capital there, and he gets all this information and stories from the priests. But then he says that he also went to Thebes and Heliopolis, which are also in Egypt, because he wanted to check if the stories told by the priests there sort of differed from the ones told in Memphis. And I think that's a really good pointer to his methodology.
It appears that Herodotus is willing or eager to go that extra mile to either authenticate stories or see if others exist.
It does seem like that, but at the same time, sometimes it seems like he's traveled to places in the past and then he's sort of putting together the information that he's gathered in those places. For example, there's these mines on the Greek island of Thasos. He says he's been there himself and provides sort of a good description of where these mines lie. But it comes up at another place as well, where he also shows his familiarity with the island. So sometimes it seems that he's sort of just been traveling to these places in the past and then sort of gathering the information. But then again, in Egypt specifically, it seems like while he was there, he went the extra mile to go and sort of... He also talks about going to the very sort of as south goes in Egypt to try to find the origin of the Nile, or at least discover some more information about it, which is a very entertaining passage in itself. So he also went to Babylon. I'm pretty sure he has some very good descriptions of these places, and Tyre on the coast of I think modern day Lebanon or Syria, one of the two.
How reliable do you think Herodotus is? As you mentioned earlier, he is known as the father of history, but some Roman historians refer to him as the father of lies. And this smear has followed him down the centuries, even to the point where some have doubted whether he even travelled at all. What do you think?
I definitely think he travelled. I don't think that's any doubt. I guess a lot of the criticism that's been leveled against him is because he's telling these tall tales, especially if he's talking about sort of past history. But then again, I think that's more of a problem of him. Well, I think that's him actually writing the stories that he hears from people instead of just inventing stuff. I don't think he was inventing stuff. And as I said earlier, he sometimes sort of makes it clear to read that he's not sure which is true or not. But yeah, for traveling, I don't think it can be doubted that he went to Egypt. He so accurately describes much of the topography there and customs, the way people dress, stuff like that. But again, we must remember that he didn't really speak any other language in Greek, right? So he sort of more or less had to rely on interpreters for information, which is in itself a problem, especially if they are out to fool him. And they might also have their own agenda. Like, for example, when he's talking about Cambyses, one of the Persian kings, he's describing him as really mad and insane. From the Persian sources, it doesn't seem that bad, but he was probably bad to the Egyptians. So the Egyptians tried to paint him in this light, and that's sort of the information that Herodotus gets. Yeah, he's not always able to sort of himself sort of get to the bottom of things.
Do you think that some of the criticisms from ancient authors was in part due to Herodotus challenging the Homeric tradition? I'm thinking in particular of the story of Paris and Helen of Troy, or Helen of Sparta, depending on your point of view. The Homeric tradition places both people in the city of Troy throughout the decade-long war, whereas Herodotus informs us of an Egyptian tradition, that Paris and Helen were blown off course to Egypt, where Helen was held in Egypt until after the Trojan War ended and the Greeks came looking for her, and Paris went west along the African coast, never to be seen again. Now Herodotus actually agrees with this account, considering that Homer's work was set on a pedestal and never really challenged. Did this perhaps lead some people to doubt his work?
I don't really think so. When you get to the point in history where, well, accepting like the early criticism, like Thucydides and stuff, when you get to the stuff in, say, early Roman periods, you've reached a point where pretty much everyone is certain that Homer wasn't really the architect behind this. It was more like it was just a compiler of just a group of compilers of information, like a collection of myth. The fact that he gets this different account, this different sort of American account from the Egyptians, I think tells us a bit more about the Egyptians' version of a similar myth. So this can raise further questions, like, did the Greeks originally get part of this myth from the Egyptians? Do they have like a similar or like a common mythical trope that goes back to either like a Proto-Indo-European custom, or did they get it from the Near Eastern cultures of Mesopotamia? That's a much broader question than we can answer right now, but I think it's interesting in itself that it chooses to include this different version of the myth.
I found it really interesting how he described it. He tries to excuse Homer at the same time as doubting him. It leaves me with the impression that he was worried about his audience's reaction.
Yes, I think so. At the time he was writing as I said, a lot of people had like Homer as the pedestal. So yeah, I think he's kind of brave for doing this. And I guess that shows like to what extent he's willing to go to sort of get to the truth. He's not just interested in telling stories just for the sake of it. He's trying to be a bit of a detective here, which I think is part of the appeal.
Herodotus is showcasing these different peoples, especially the Egyptians. However, do you think his accounts are accurate, or is he defining what it is to be Greek, considering that at this time the notion of a unified Greek identity is still in its infancy?
Well, I mean, he's definitely interested in sort of the Greek versus non-Greek culture and customs. I think his audience pretty much knew already what it sort of meant to be Greek in a sense. As I said earlier, I mean, he always tries to ground his observations of other peoples in Greek customs and cultures. So, for example, he will at times call out certain customs for being sort of laudable or really just appalling to Greek eyes, or sometimes his own. He sort of just says, like, personally, I think that this is an outrageous custom and that sometimes reflects the Greek customs. And he will regularly say stuff like, in this they differ from the Greeks, or like they have the same gods as we do. So, especially with religion, he always tries to sort of equate like Egyptian and Persian gods with familiar Greek gods. So, I mean, it's clearly important for him to do this, sort of get a Greek point of reference. And so this makes sense for him personally as a way to understand foreign cultures, but also for his audience, right, who might only have their own sort of city's culture or just their own Greek point of view as a reference point.
So Herodotus isn't actually criticising different cultures and customs, and he explores how differences are products of upbringing, tradition, and different perceptions of what constitutes normal. Can you tell us about this story?
Okay, so the story of the Greeks and Indians at the court of Darius is, I think, quite telling about sort of the different, like how cultures have different customs, and it's not necessarily saying that the Greeks are the very best. So he says here in the translation here that, just suppose that someone proposed to the entirety of mankind that a selection of the very best practices be made from the sum of human custom. Each group of people, after carefully sifting through the customs of other peoples, would surely choose its own. Everyone believes his own customs to be far and away the best, right? So that's sort of what he's trying to get at. It's not necessarily putting Greek or Greece on a pedestal. So from this, it follows that only a madman would think to jeer at such matters. Indeed, there is a huge amount of corroborating evidence to support the conclusion that this attitude to one's own native customs is universal. And now comes the story of the Greek and Persians. So take, for example, this story from the reign of Darius. He called together some Greeks who were present and asked them how much money they would wish to be paid to devour the corpses of their fathers. To which the Greeks replied that no amount of money would suffice for that. And next, Darius summoned some Indians called Calantians, who do eat their parents, and asks them in the presence of the Greeks, who were able to follow what was being said by means of an interpreter, how much money it would take to buy their consent to the cremation of their dead fathers. At which the Galantians cried out in horror and told him that his words were a desecration of silence. Such then is how custom operates, and how right Pindar is, it seems to me, when he declares in his poetry that custom is the king of all.
I think what Herodotus has shown here is the universality of human nature. What we experience in our own local areas informs our perception of normality, and to stray outside even a little can generate such an emotional backlash. And Herodotus is pointing out that neither is right or wrong, but rather just a product of our upbringing.
Yes, I think so. I mean, and this is a common theme throughout his works. He loves to explore other people's customs and compare them with his own. I love seeing that curiosity aspect of his mind at work. And you get a lot of funny stuff from that. So, yeah, he's a great storyteller for that.
Picking up on his ability as a storyteller, would you like to share with us some of them that you find particularly interesting?
So, I mean, the Battle of Thermopylae is the one, as I said, with the Spartans, and that. So we all know this story, whether you've just seen the very Herodotus-based movies that's, portraying the Persians in a wildly inaccurate light, but that's not matter. So he's talking about this huge army of 3 million Persians with the armada and supply lines and everything versus the 300 Spartans. There's this whole sort of dramatic battle narrative, like the Persians keep on trying to break down the wall and get through, but they can't because the Spartans are just so strong and determined and just so willed. It's just very entertaining, a very engaging narrative. So, and you get like really cool lines, like, for example, this from the book here. There is a witticism attributed to this Spartan called Dionysus, which he made before battle was joined with the Medes, that is the Persians. Right? So teeming are the barbarians, someone from Trachis warned him, that when they fire the bows, the arrows blot out the sun. That is the measure of their number. Dionysus, however, far from being unnerved by this, instead took so little account of the vast multitudes of the Medes that he only commented, "Well, my friend from Trachis, this news of yours is all to the good. If the Medes hide the sun, then we could fight them in the shade rather than in the glare of the day." Yeah, I mean that's an example of sort of the Spartan sort of hardness and sort of dry. Well, not humour, but just.
I suppose it could be considered dry humour in one sense, and adding dramatic effect in another. Just like the arrows that cause an eclipse of the sun, he likes to emphasise the size of the army by recounting how they kept drinking rivers dry due to their massive number, leaving an image of a series of dry riverbeds acting as markers of the army's progress. However, within even that one story, we have another David and Goliath situation, and it allows him to display all the qualities and virtues that are associated at this time with being Greek.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very patriotic narrative, I mean, even though he's not from Sparta, but I mean it's patriotic in the sense that it's sort of a common Greek gathering of city-states, and they're sort of just standing together against this common enemy, which I guess has been some of the appeal for so much of Western culture. Although the story is much more more nuanced than that. It's much more complex than a simple like every Greek state gathered together to fight this enemy. I mean, even Herodotus acknowledges there were so many Greek states that sort of opposed and just went on the Greek sides, and you don't always hear about those, especially in sort of later Western narratives and stuff like that. But that's a story for another day. Like on the other end of the spectrum, I mean, he has all these dramatic stories, especially in his later books concerning the wars themselves. Then again, he also had these really fun stories throughout his book, especially in sort of the early books. There's this one story about the Babylonian queen Nitocris, which Herodotus seems to look up to very much, finds it very interesting. So he has this to say about his queen. The same queen, that is Nitocris, was also responsible for a notable trick devised against posterity. She had a tomb built for herself over the most frequented gate of the city, of Babylon, embedded within the fabric of the structure itself directly above the lintel, and engraved with the following inscription. Should any king who ascends the throne of Babylon after me find himself short of treasure, then let him open my tomb and take as much as he wants. Only poverty, however, will suffice as justification. No other will do, and better for him not to presume otherwise. This tomb remained undisturbed until the reign of Darius, who, unwilling to use the gate since it would have required him to drive directly underneath a corpse, thought it insufferable that one of the city gates should be out of bounds to him. On top of that, it struck him as ludicrous not to take the treasure when it was just sitting there, complete with its come hither inscription, and so he opened up the tomb. Inside it, however, he found no treasure waiting for him, but only the corpse and one further inscription. It read, "So this is the measure of your lust for treasure, and of the depths to which your greed has plunged you, that you think nothing of forcing the tomb of the dead."
I love that. She's basically just laid a trap to shame somebody in the future.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a really fun story. There's loads of these throughout the spoken name.
Do you think this shows a bit of Herodotus' personality? He found little episodes like this really funny or really interesting and wanted to share it with people.
Definitely, yes, I think so. I mean, it shows. I think so much of Herodotus shows through his book, like the way he structures his book, like how he digresses on stuff, and that he says that he wants to digress because that's what he do. It's sort of like how modern historians would do footnotes, but only he incorporates them into the text and then sort of goes even further afield. But he always sort of reels it back in again. He never. Well, I say always. I mean, there's a couple of instances like he says stuff like, "I'll get to this. I'll explain this story in a later narrative," and then just never does, which is funny by itself. And yeah, there's another set of stories about this. This guy Pisistratus was a tyrant in the early days of Athens, and he apparently tried to seize power in Athens 3 times. Well, he was successful 3 times. So the first time he sort of fooled the people into believing, because he was this very sort of established nobleman and greatly respected. He'd like won some battle, I think, being a general. So he fooled the people into believing that he had been like almost attacked. So he ran like with his cart and with a knife in his hand, like, help me. And so the people of Athens supplied him with a bodyguard that he then used to stage a coup and take over the city. And then he sort of made a deal with this guy called Megacles after he had been sort of ousted from the city. So Megacles was a guy who had a lot of power and influence there. The deal was that he would marry this guy's daughter, and then he would help him get back. So when the second time, they found a really tall girl and sort of dressed her in armor and put her on this wagon, and they drove her through the city, and she was just shouting stuff like, "Oh, I am the goddess Athena, and you have to get this guy back into power." And according to Herodotus, they believed her. So they got back into power by sort of divine right, and then they managed to sort of oust him again. And the third time, just straight up gathered an army and tried to attack the city. But even then, I mean, it's not a straightforward war narrative. He can't really take the city. So there's a whole thing involved, there's a prophecy involved, and he does like a classic sneak attack according to the prophecy, and then he managed to take the city. It's just really funny to read.
It's quite interesting that this account suggests that it's easier to take Athens than it is to hold it without consent.
I think he has a snide comment in there as well about it portrays the Athenians as very gullible people, I think. And I don't think he's saying this directly, but it could be interpreted, at least by some people, as sort of a snide comment against democracy, especially if you think about like Herodotus didn't grow up in a democracy. And democracy was, as it is today, it was a very rare thing and very loathed by a lot of people, especially in this day and age where Herodotus is writing, because he's writing at a time when Athens has expanded into this massive, it's like this empire, right? And they're being really imperialistic and quite cruel to many of the dependencies, right? And they're sort of enforcing democracy on these guys, and they don't really want it. Well, a lot of them don't really want it, right? So that's one way to look at it as well. Maybe the work as a whole, but again, that's a whole different podcast, I suppose.
There are also some fanciful tales about animals that were said to exist in this time. Can you tell us about some of those?
Well, there's this one story in India, for example, about gigantic ants that are guarding this treasure. No, not treasure, this desert in India, which is filled sort of with sand dust. So he has this whole story going on about how the Indians, because the Indians are so rich. They've always been that throughout antiquity, right? A lot of jewels and stuff. But anyway, so he's telling this story about how Indians get on top of camels, have these bags that I fill up with sand in the desert. And the moment they sort of fill them up with sand, the giant ants come sort of crawling up out of the earth, and they sort of chase the camels. And they have to choose a specific type of camel that will just run for it. It's really leggy, right? And it's really dramatic. Like, they have to escape the giant ants. It's so fun. And I think...
Does he not tell us that it's the female camels who have young back at home that are the best ones because they'll run faster to get to their offspring?
Yeah, exactly. It's just so unhinged.
I also found it interesting how Herodotus discusses seeing the bones of a creature. And the way it's described, we would maybe consider it with the mythical creature the griffin. But Tom Holland, in one of his talks about Herodotus, kind of jokingly suggests that maybe it's all dinosaur bones. And I actually think there could be something in that. There's no reason to believe ancients didn't come across ancient dinosaur remains. And this was their way of trying to make sense of what they were seeing.
Yeah, I think that's plausible. I think there's been a lot of speculation about these sort of dinosaur bones popping up and been found by people who have been interpreted as various mythical creatures. I think especially of dragons. The dragon or the worm, everything, that sort of thing has been sort of a very constant sort of mythical element in a lot of cultures, right? You also got this stuff in... There's one passage in Herodotus too that mentions these giant bones that they think are like the bones of Homeric heroes, because they were said to be much taller and much stronger, which also could be something similar, right? Like, so it was talking about finding this grave or like this coffin, which is huge, and it contained the body of Orestes, the son of Agamemnon. So there's a lot of stuff like, and the sort of the mythical sort of blends in with the historical writing, which I think is very fascinating.
It does add a good element of entertainment to it. The one thing I found while reading the book was, by the end I felt like I knew Herodotus to a certain extent, and I could easily relate to his enthusiasm for different peoples and different cultures.
I definitely think so. He has a very special sort of personality and way of writing that you get really familiar with over the course of reading. I think he's a very entertaining persona that is sort of transmitting. Yeah.
It is very infectious. It's a bit like reading a good thriller book where it's a constant page turner and you don't want to put it down as you really want to find out what happens next.
Yes, you're not going to find, I think, anything like Herodotus, at least written in antiquity. It's very unique for that. It's been hated by people for that in the past. I think he's sort of redeeming himself a bit, or he's being redeemed a bit by modern scholars. Because again, like, we gotta remember, I mean, he wasn't writing a history book as we would call it. He was trying to do something entirely else. So, like, he was trying to make observations. He was both trying to get to the bottom of like how this war started out, the Persian Wars, the causation of it. But he was also trying to just gather information and gather stories. He has all these ethnographic observations underway, information about monuments and stuff in other cities, in other worlds.
And it fits with his approach. The word history in his time meant inquiry. So from that perspective, inquiring about a myriad of peoples, cultures and customs is achieving exactly what he had set out to do.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's a much wider definition than just sort of history. Because, it sort of encompasses all these ideas.
Before we wrap up, would you like to tell us about some of the more outlandish and funny stories in his work?
Yes, there's a couple of stories in the very first book that I find really funny. One of them is talking about, he's starting to talk about this kingdom of Lydia, as I told you about earlier, and he's talking about sort of the founder of the Lydian kingdom, and this is really just unhinged story about this Lydian king Candaules and his sort of mate Gyges. And Candaules is going on and on about his wife. She's so beautiful, mate. You have no idea. I mean, you should see her naked. What? No, I can't see her naked. And it's like, oh no, you really should, because she's just so amazing, you know. No, I mean, I don't believe you, right?
What an awful thing to say to your mate about your wife. Yeah, come and see my wife, the Queen, naked.
Yeah, my wife, the Queen, come and see her naked. You know, I have this amazing plan for you. So when we go to bed tonight, you just sneak in behind her and you can just watch her. You can see how pretty she is naked. And don't worry, she's not going to see you, I promise. And what happens? Well, she sees him, obviously. So she sort of confronts this guy, Gyges, the other day, like the next day. And like, I know what you did. I know what you saw. Like, okay, here's an ultimatum. Either I will have you killed or you help me kill my husband. What? It's just so funny.
I always felt sorry for Gyges in this story. Being put into two impossible situations by people who have the power of life and death over you.
Yeah, exactly. And it ends with like, guys, well, I don't want to die, right? So he's just going on along with it and kills Candaules. And then sort of he by doing so, it's sort of, we get into this sort of mythical pattern again with hubris and nemesis and sort of that actions have consequences. And because of he does this, it sort of imparts a curse upon his family, which ends up in Croesus being eventually slain. And you get this stuff about King Croesus getting to this prophecy about if he goes to war with the Persian Empire, he will destroy a mighty empire. And it's just so ambiguous, right? He ends up destroying a mighty empire, but it is his own, which is so funny, right? And at that point, you sort of the curse has been fulfilled, which is a common theme again throughout his histories. There's another very funny story early on about this mythical poet Arrian, who's been traveling to Tarentum, which was a city in southern Italy, I think it was to perform at a music festival. And on the way back, he just arrived on a ship, which turns out to be a pirate ship, and they want to rob him because he has a very fancy lyre. And then he says like, guys, you know, sure, you can take my gold, but please let me just jump off the ship myself. And can you do that if I'm just allowed to play your song, right? And it's like, sure, we can listen. Like they feel like it's a good idea just listen to a song before he dies. Like, oh, that's cool. So he plays a really beautiful song, and then he sort of jumps out the ship, as I told he's gonna do. And then this random thing happens. There's a dolphin who comes and picks him up and carries him back to Corinth, where he came from. And he talks to the king about this, like, oh, this dolphin saved my life, and you know, you gotta hear about these pirates and stuff. So when the pirates are bound for Corinth, right? That's why he hitched the ship with them. So they arrive at Corinth, and then sort of they get called into the king, and the king sort of asks them questions like, you wouldn't happen to have seen this, this musician, right? No, we haven't seen him, and or it's either that, or it was like, yeah, he hitched a ride on our ship, but you know, he died sadly on the way, and all this treasure got lost in the sea. Oh, it's a shame. And then the Arrian just sort of pops up like, here I am, and then and the pirates gets killed. It's just really funny. There's so many of these stories throughout this entire work. I can only hardly recommend reading it to anyone who's interested in funny stories in general or history. It's got something for everyone, I think.
It definitely does keep you entertained. I think what makes the Gyges myth so relatable is it could actually be imagined as true. If we picture a young king who's immature, chauvinistic, he would boast to his mates about his beautiful wife and perhaps even suggest such a shameful act. However, what I love about the stories is their intention to speak to people who have suffered injustice and say to them, see those who have committed crimes, they will eventually reap what they sow and get their comeuppance. It's kind of like a version of our more modern concept of karma.
Yes, that's true. I mean, there's certainly some themes running throughout the stories that we can relate to. I think that's also part of the appeal about his stories.
Well, Sondre, thank you so much for coming on and discussing my favourite historian, Herodotus.
I completely agree. He's by far my favorite, yes. Well, thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure.
And that's it for this week. If you would like to join the discussion, or have any questions, or would like to even be a guest on the show, you can email us at discoverhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on social media at Discover History, except Twitter, which is at History Podcast. Thanks for listening.